Well, the first characteristic of the rise of the United States was its anti-Europe bias. And we could see this embodied in our very first U.S. president, George Washington. George Washington, of course, is on our dollar bill, and he is this iconic figure whose reputation is almost never questioned in the United States. He is worshipped in an almost religious-like way. But one of the things that George Washington imparted in his farewell address to the American public after serving 2 terms as president, and this itself was significant, the fact that he left office, because many suggested that he should not leave, that he should just become a king. And George Washington was convinced that the kind of conservative counter-revolution that followed the American Revolution should not go so far as to create an imperial state in which he or anyone else would be the king. It should be a government in which we elected leaders and that they should rotate. Well, George Washington said, "Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition?" Now, he had much more to say on this topic as well, but what Washington left us was a tradition that lasted for some 150 years of largely non-interference in European wars, which were far too frequent, and moreover, a legacy of maintaining very, very small peacetime militaries. So for most of the United States' history, we maintained extremely small militaries. We let European states bankrupt themselves by pursuing rivalries and wars and maintaining large militaries. And we instead built our real economy. That's where we focused our investment, not on a permanent military economy. Very different from Europe. Moreover, our early American leaders had a great distaste for European aristocracy and the idea of inherited privilege. They believed in actually making your own way in the world, and indeed, even some of the richest Gilded Age robber barons of the late 19th century maintained this view, and after collecting enormous fortunes by any standard, including today's, more or less gave all of their money away upon their death, rather than impart it to their children, who it was thought would just waste it away in various pursuits that would probably be not very good for them nor the country. So these were the traditions of the United States that gave rise to a very powerful economy and, frankly, a very solid society. Continuing in this trend of those defining features of the early American Republic, we see this gentleman, who was on our $10 bill, Alexander Hamilton. He was our first Secretary of the Treasury, and in 1791, he put forward a very important written work that lacked a sexy title. In fact, it was quite dull. It was called The Report on Manufactures. And I find that there's kind of an inverse relationship between the attractiveness of a book's title and the quality of its contents. Well, the Report on Manufactures was Hamilton's defining statement on how the American economy should develop. Should it follow free trade principles? Hamilton said no. He said while he understood that perhaps there were certain ethical or moral advantages, in his estimation, to pursuing this path, that this was the road to poverty and prosperity. So contra Friedrich von Hayek's road to serfdom, Alexander Hamilton said that the lack, actually, of the state and its interference in the economy would be a road to poverty. And so Hamilton suggested that the United States put in place protective tariffs to support its infant industries. And the reason was that we lived in a kind of dangerous world, and Hamilton thought, well, we could be attacked by the British again. We would be in 1812. or the French or the Spanish or these other aggressive European imperial powers, and best to have an economy that could produce the goods to develop our nation, our early republic, if so needed. So Hamilton put forward these ideas, and initially they were opposed by the South. It wanted to buy superior goods from the United Kingdom at the lowest price. They wanted, in effect, consumer-friendly policies. Now, Hamilton said this was very short-sighted. He said, no, you don't want this. You want to make people pay more in the short run for goods, to pay the cost of actually developing infant industries, and that this, in turn, would lead to development and eventually a very advanced economy. Well, in 1794, 3 years later, his ideas were accepted by the North. And one has to remember that the North had no comparative advantages in terms of economic development. Its soils were rocky, its climate was cold. There was nothing that would suggest that it would go on to become the leading technological, innovating area of the global economy. And it was in this context and environment of having no comparative advantages that Hamilton said you could construct a world-class economy, and did so through advocating the use of protective tariffs. Now, contra this idea that the United States has always somehow had a kind of a free trade regime, throughout the entire 19th century, the United States maintained some of the highest import tariffs in the world. In fact, after its Civil War in the 1860s, when the North finally prevailed over the South, it raised tariffs even further. So when there was no opposition from the South any longer, which were actually working to keep the tariffs from being as high as they possibly could be, the North raised them even far more, and American industry advanced and raced ahead. Now, this was made possible by several factors. One, it was a big country, lots of raw materials, big enough population so that you could have competing national enterprises, so that you would not just have monopolies. So there were some special factors at play, but it worked very, very well indeed for the United States. Again, transforming rural, bucolic, rocky New England into the core of the global economy. This little illustration at the bottom suggests that the United States' politics have not always been civil. The fellow that's pointing the pistol and firing it was the second vice president of the country, Aaron Burr, who, after making some insults about Alexander Hamilton's daughter, got challenged to a duel and was killed. Another important figure is Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant served as President of the United States after the Civil War. He served for 2 terms, and he ended up on our $50 bill. Now, Grant was under increasing pressure from the United Kingdom to lower tariffs. The States kept raising these things to promote national economic development, infant industries, and the United Kingdom was getting very irritated indeed with the United States. So after receiving many of these complaints from the United Kingdom, Grant responded with this rejoinder, in which he stated, thus, in explaining England's development, he said, for centuries, England has relied on protection, protective tariffs, has carried it to extremes, and has obtained satisfactory results from it. There is no doubt that it is to this system that it owes its present strength. After 2 centuries, England has found it convenient to adopt free trade because it thinks that protection can no longer offer it anything. What he meant by that was that England was now the world's most advanced economy, and therefore protective tariffs no longer served its interest. Its interests, instead, were served by opening up other countries to free trade, or, in short, to British goods. He says, very well, gentlemen, then. My knowledge of our country leads me to believe that within 200 years, when America has gotten out of protection all that it can offer, it too will adopt free trade. Well, Ulysses S. Grant, if he was alive today, should have been investing in the stock market because he was an amazingly accurate forecaster of future trends. Now, his timing was a little bit off, but he got it exactly right in terms of what the United States would do. After the United States became the dominant economy in the world, after its technology was superior to all others, it too would shift to a free trade regime and push others to strongly follow in that direction. Other nations began to see the advantages of moving in the opposite direction of the United Kingdom's advice on free trade. Again, Latin America, for the most part, throughout the entire 19th century, persisted in following British free trade doctrine and only remained underdeveloped for it. Nations that departed from it were Germany, with its German Historical School of Economic Development, led by people such as Friedrich List, and then Japan. Japan's move towards industrialization was one that happened in a very unique or distinctive way. The United States decided to visit Japan in 1853. Commodore Matthew Perry was the naval officer who did so. You can see these depictions of his visit to Japan, both created by the Japanese, and of course, an American photo of him. And Perry's object or interest in visiting Japan was as thus. Just as today, fuel is very important, thus it was in 1853 that fossil fuels were also very, very important. The steam engine had been developed, industrialization began to move apace because of it, and shipping began to be powered by it. Now, coal is very bulky, twice as bulky as oil in terms of the amount of energy that you get out of it. So ships had to make more stops than they do today to fuel up. Now, it so happened that Japan had something that the United States was interested in, coal. And the United States was interested primarily in engaging China in trade, but it needed a fuel stop. That fuel stop could be Japan. So the United States went to visit and to see what prospects there were for buying coal, and they discovered that the Japanese were not too happy or enthusiastic about their visit. Japan, for complicated reasons I won't go into right now, had been in a roughly 200-year-long period of isolation, had dropped behind the developed nations of the world, and again had this very rude awakening when this American could just show up with far superior technology and more or less tell them that whether they liked it or not, they were now open for business. And Perry brought all sorts of interesting things with him. He brought this kind of model railroad that was at 1/4 actual scale. He thought that would impress the Japanese. It did. And the Japanese response was interesting. Rather than just accept the idea that they needed to completely copy or emulate these foreigners, the Americans, and do exactly as they said in terms of what it took to economically develop or to follow the United Kingdom, the Japanese took a very unique approach. They set up a think tank or policy institute, which their name, of course, is quite instructive regarding their attitude about Americans and foreigners generally. They termed it the Institute for the Study of Barbarian Books. So the idea was that they would learn from these barbarians. It was clear to the Japanese that these were culturally backward people that had very little to offer in terms of learning how to live, how to behave oneself, but they had great gadgets. And one needed to figure out how to make these things. So the Japanese, with the Meiji Restoration beginning in the 1860s, got busy, and they started doing so. And they paid back the Americans' visit in 1853 with a visit of their own in 1941. which led to the destruction of the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. A quite daring and quite impressive and successful episode in which the Japanese projected industrial power, quite amazing when you think about it, because just a short 80 years before this, they were a feudal state, living in the most technologically primitive conditions. And within a very few short decades, they taught the United States a nasty lesson. Now, they still were not on the level of the United States, and their kind of cultural hubris didn't provide them with the perspective that they needed in order to determine whether it was such a good idea to do this. And so they didn't fare very well in that war. But nonetheless, it was quite interesting that they were able to develop so quickly. And of course, as you know, they taught your country a bit of a lesson as well in the early 20th century. So the Japanese were all about teaching people lessons at this time, and were meeting them out fairly regularly. We have a United States that was not, for the most part, busying itself with other parts of the world, Latin America accepted, which we kind of consider to be our own property for some reason. So we always had very small militaries, staying out of foreign affairs for the most part, foreign engagements, not spending lavishly on militaries. And we built the world's most robust industrial economy by the 20th century. Now, one of the problems with this economy is that as it matured, is it had this tendency to move towards financialization. This led to some significant problems in the 1920s because the logic of the American economy was moving away from one of high wages and industrial development. And something that we should mention is that from the start, the United States had the highest wages in the world. The reason for this was because of the great interior or frontier that we had, which is kind of code for Indian lands that we stole. But this great frontier was always a place where the American worker could set themselves up as a subsistence farmer. So if working conditions were too rotten, you could just go take off and settle yourself somewhere on the frontier. This created, again, very high wages, which was a very good push factor for innovation and for mechanization in industrialization. By the 1920s, the logic of competition began to erode the desire or the logic of having a high-wage economy. Henry Ford, the great auto industrialist, understood in the 1920s that if people were going to buy his automobiles, they were going to have to earn enough money to buy them. And so he was an advocate of high wages in the American tradition. He imposed the $5 a day wage, which was a good bit of change for that time. But even with him, the logic of the system eventually worked to stagnate that wage, and he couldn't get it up any higher than that because of competition from other industries. And demand in the economy began to take the form of credit and of large speculative rents extracted in the financial sector from the real economy, which led to very gross levels of inequality, ultimately instability, and then a crash of the American economy. The original response to the Great Depression was to impose austerity policies. I mean, this is what the liberal economic tradition said that you should do in response to a crisis. We had Say's law in economics, which more or less said that any economy will more or less restore itself, correct itself, if you just drive wages down enough to serve as an inducement to get employers to begin hiring again. But during the Great Depression, you had people holding signs on the streets saying they would work for food. They weren't even asking for money anymore. So Say's law proved not to be a law. It was inoperable. It didn't work. Similar problems happened in other parts of the world. In Italy, in the mid-1920s, there was a financial crisis, which was fought with austerity policies. Eventually, this resulted in Benito Mussolini taking power. Germany, it is often thought that Adolf Hitler came to power because of the Weimar period and the massive inflation, and that somehow the government just got carried away with printing money because they were indisciplined. Well, the history is actually quite different. The Weimar period and the high inflation of that time was more or less a calculated effort by the Weimar government to screw the French and the British, who were exacting these high reparation payments after World War I. So the Germans got the clever idea, we'll just inflate these debts away. We'll just flood the economy with so much money that these debts will be worthless. We'll show them. Well, all right, they did. But at some point, they ruined their own economy too, and then they imposed very strict austerity policies in 31, 32, and that created a lot of economic pain, and then this Adolf Hitler guy somehow came into power. Something similar in Japan happened. In the early 1930s, the crisis had spread to Japan, and they too were imposing strict austerity policies in an effort to combat this crisis, which was only making it worse. And eventually, the Japanese military kind of got tired of it, and they just decided to seize control more or less of the government, and we know what we got there. So, to quote the American literary figure Mark Twain, while history does not always repeat itself, it does have a tendency to rhyme, and so we should be quite concerned about this fire that we're currently playing with, which are austerity policies. Now, the United States took measures after trying all of the wrong solutions to correct the situation, and it began to do things like to regulate finance, pass the Glass-Steagall reforms, regulating the financial sector, separating commercial banks from other kinds of banking. It increased wages with the minimum wage. Now, this is quite bold. Think about this. Imagine if you're in an economic crisis, which is much worse than the one that we just experienced. There are all of these pressures to try and find jobs for people. People can't even find work if they're begging for food on the streets with signs, and then all of a sudden you propose, well, we have to come up with legislation to actually jack wages way up. It was very counterintuitive. Economists of the time hated it. But the American president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was very pragmatic. He was not ideological at all, and he was willing to experiment. And so at first he thought austerity policies were the way to go. And like a reasonable person, once he tried them, saw that they didn't work, he said, well, let's try something else. So they tried increasing wages, bringing the number of hours that people worked down to spread employment out. And this was very important too, because of urbanization, which existed in the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century. We just had a lot more people in the cities than we used to, and we didn't have enough industrial jobs for them, given increasing productivity. And so we needed to find ways of spreading this work out to more workers, and we did that through reducing the work week. That takes us to the end of, let's say, World War II. World War II solved the Great Depression because of the incredible demand that it generated in the economy. So the New Deal itself didn't do it. As much money as was spent, it wasn't enough to actually solve the Great Depression. World War II, though, did it. And the United States all of a sudden found itself in a position of global leadership after the French and the British had more or less spent themselves, exhausted themselves and their economies after World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. And thus began the American century, finally.